I have quite a different background and expertise to Professor Hasler, but I think this is going to follow on really well from what he's just talked about in terms of the importance of sheds and then thinking about what it is that makes them successful based on the research we've looked at. Just to tell you a little bit more about myself, so my area of work is on voluntary organisations and volunteers. I've been doing substantial work in the UK. You might notice my accent, but I have been in Australia for many years now. This is also drawing on a specific project that my colleagues, Peter McAvoy, Jonathan Furlan, have been working on, looking at men's sheds. We're going to take you through some of that material. So, what makes a successful voluntary association? Well, men's sheds are voluntary associations, and most voluntary associations have a number of challenges. These are some of the key ones that have come up generally for all voluntary associations, not specifically for men's sheds. So one of the challenges is recruiting and keeping your members, succession planning for the key roles, so there's key roles like president, secretary, treasurer, finding people to take those on, making sure you don't have the same person doing it from year to year. And I know one of the people asking questions was commenting on they had a number of these different roles, so you don't just have the same people rotating through the roles. One year you're president, next year you're treasurer, then you're secretary, and then you're back to president again. And I'm sure we're all very familiar with that, not just maybe in your men's shed, but in some of the other associations that you've been involved in over your lives. That's very common. Another issue is about how do you resource your activities. So, you want to do all sorts of different activities. You want to travel to the conference. You want to go and meet other sheds, perhaps. And how do you find the resourcing to do those kinds of activities? How do you find the expertise? How do you find the funding? I'm also really interested, I've put others here, because I'm really interested to hear from you what you see as some of the key challenges for your sheds. I'm going to open it up now. If you've got any suggestions you'd like to put forward. Yes, actually, I possibly should have told you about it. Got the microphone beforehand. But I'm really keen to hear about any other specific challenges you're finding in your shed that is making it difficult to be successful. We've got one here.
This is Jamie Burney from Pilgrim University. One of our biggest ones, because we're a developing shed and aren't actually existing at the moment, is statutory requirements. They're just a nightmare. All government departments require different things, ATO, non-profit stuff, and incorporation. And it's been very, very difficult. And I think that most of the guys in our shed, they thought that they knew how difficult it was going to be, they probably wouldn't have done it.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And of course, you're all volunteers. So it's not like you've got all this time to do this, or you're necessarily experts where in terms of getting through the legislation. That's a really common problem for voluntary associations is top-down legislation that they have to deal with. You see it in sports clubs, that new health and safety legislation comes in and they have to implement that. And it takes hours of paperwork that no one really has the time to do, no one really knows what they're doing. So that's a very good point. We've got one here, excellent.
Fred Bronsma from the Montgomery Men's Shed. We have got something like 80, 90 members. We don't see them. We only can see about 30 members constantly. The other members we don't see. So what should we do to try and encourage them to come to the shed?
Yeah. So people on the books not coming in. So, and you get that both as members and as people who are supposed to be volunteering as well and helping out. We've got one here, right?
I'm from Calabar, and the problem we have, and I think it's going to be part of most country clubs, is attracting younger members to the future.
And can I ask, because age is relative, by younger, what are we talking here?
That's a good question without giving my age away.
Roughly.
Okay, well look at the age group of the people here. Probably every age is probably like 65, 70. And it's very hard to attract people under that age.
Okay, yeah, thanks for the clarification. I think it's just useful.
G'day, my name's Clinton Rumpel and I'm from Caribou, Manshed. It's interesting to talk about the age differences. One of the issues we have in our Manshed is people being able to have access without somebody at the shed. Our Manshed have put in video cameras now and an automatic swipe card system, and we've drawn up a policy about access to it. But our problem is the insurance. The insurance has it that you need to have another person at the shed at the same time. In the Pilbara and the way the people work in the mining industries, and also in the remote towns like Exmouth and that, they find the need to let people have ordinary access on their own to do special stuff. The people are a much younger age group that attend there, and they've also been conditioned to a lot of safety through the mining industry. So if somebody can help us with insurance issues, that'd be great.
Yeah, Brian Donovan, Morgan Village, Manshed. It's for your question actually about shed access. What works for us is 2 members any time. So we have a coded entry system, and any 2 members can go down there anytime they like. It covers the insurance problem because there's 2 of them, but that's the only rule. 2 members must be, and it works very well for us. We're a small group, so maybe it wouldn't work for a big shed, but yeah.
Thank you. Well, that's great. We've just got a solution. Excellent. We'll take 3 more. This one, and then one at the back. Okay.
First of all, I'm going to introduce our table. We've got members from Falcon, Yanship, from Moore, and from Geraldton, and the 3 of us from Pinjarra. We're at a shed that only started 3 years ago. We had absolutely nothing but a dream. And we were valued the other day at about $750,000. Wow. Now, the reason being, when we went and visited the companies and the grant groups and so forth, we didn't tell them what we wanted from them. We told them if you can help. And we've just experienced a situation where a company called Medallia Steel is doing an extension for us, and they've given us the entire steel trusses and all to do that proposal. We didn't go along and say, well, will you give us a discount? We just said, can you help us? And we did that all the way through. And you suddenly see when a project starts to come together, it has this thing called generosity of people. You never know what they are thinking of giving you. And the other thing you were emphasising earlier on, it's important that you rotate your team. I've just finished 3 years I'm about to finish 3 years as chairman, and I gladly hand over the reins to another committee member, and I can tell you now we've got a very good nucleus here, and we're going places.
Great.
Neil Kennedy from the Raleigh Star Manshed. I'd like to address the second point there, which is succession planning. It was touched on there in the last comment. One of our biggest problems is we're a relatively new shed. We're still trying to get established, and we've been spending the last in excess of 4 years trying to get a building and get all this negotiated. It's very hard to hand over the reins to somebody else when you're halfway through a negotiation as critical as this. And quite frankly, I'm one of the people that's reaching burnout point. This is almost a full-time job dealing with statutory authorities and everybody else. And it's not a role you can hand over. So if someone's got some advice on how best to manage that, I'm the first to be listening. Thank you.
Right. And it was just that last one at the back. I'm sure there's others, but we'll...
Hi, my name's Roy Haven and I'm the chairman of the Vincent Manshed. Going on with that succession plan, I can understand what the gentleman there is saying, how you can get to burnout point very, very easily. But you've got people in the shed who are always saying, we've got to do this, we've got to do that, we've got to do this. But when it comes to the time of putting their hand up to join the committee, you can't see anybody for the dust. And that's just, if someone can give us advice on what's the easiest way to try and recruit chairman, treasurer, secretary, it becomes almost impossible. Thanks.
Good point. It's an ongoing challenge. So, in fact, it's interesting, in my introduction, I mentioned that I'm chair of what we call CORFI, the Council for Australasian Tourism, Hospitality, Education. I am standing down in February. I've told everyone I'm standing down in February. I've done it for 3 years. My research tells me that 3 years is about the right kind of time to do this kind of role. And I've been phoning around a number of potential people to take it on, but I'm standing down. I've made that very clear. Now, I know it's hard to do that. This is a professional association. It's a little bit different. People working in the field. But sometimes, you actually have to stand down and vacate a role. And you can even see, in a different context, but when we were looking at some voluntary events that are run, Beef Week in Casino in New South Wales, a few years ago, they couldn't find anyone to join the volunteer group to run the event. So the event didn't happen. All the people were saying, we're not going to do it, we're not going to do it, and they didn't do it. And there was no event for 1 year. And then the following year, lots of people said, we can't let that happen again. And they went forward to run it. So it's a bit extreme, but sometimes those kind of extreme ways saying, when I said no, I meant no, can help. Because you don't want to go through burnout. That is the opposite of what Professor Hassan was talking about when he talked about why you should join a group. You shouldn't join a group to get burnout. So these are some of the factors that I also thought, what might be important in terms of the governance in your organisation, in your shed, the location of your shed, networks that your shed is involved in, other organisations you're working with, partnerships that you might have with other sheds or other community groups, the size of the shed. Well, maybe it could be too, there could be the occasional one in the room that people think perhaps is too big. You're struggling with, maybe not. Okay. The types of members that you've got. If you have lots of members who are members on the books but aren't coming in, aren't turning up, the kinds of activities that your shed does. So I'm going to give you the outcomes we've had so far from the research we've been doing, which is primarily based on literature review. So we're trying to understand what are the factors that make us successful in Men's Shed. And this is the project we've been working on with Men's Shed WA. And this is the first stage in our research. So I'll do about the next stage at the end of the presentation. So this is about what we already know. And I know Professor Hassan is talking a lot about what we already know. So it's really important to look at what we already know before we start trying to find out new information. Well, what our search did was reinforce the uniqueness of Men's Sheds as voluntary associations that exist for mutual aid. So we found there's a lot of mutual aid associations out there, but they're not really the same. They're basically like Alcoholics Anonymous. That's not really the same as what Men's Shed's trying to do. So, and there's a lot of voluntary associations, but they're not necessarily there to actually bring about long-term benefits, in terms of health for the members. It's a very, very unique organisation. So, what do we know about the impact of Men's Sheds? Well, some of this has been covered already, but we know that they are beneficial in improving the health and well-being of members, specifically the mental health, but also some physical health benefits, but not as often. And as Professor Hassan talked, attendance at the Men's Shed is associated with decreased levels of depression and increased confidence and self-esteem. And a recent review has shown that there's a direct link as well between the types of activities that Men's Sheds are doing and the health benefits of their members. So, for example, doing practical activities like woodwork or metal work can result in the members increasing their movement, reducing sedentary time, and having improved mobility. So it actually helps their physical health by doing those activities. So that's quite an important finding. We also found that there were some key areas that really showed, that were really identified within the literature, and these were the funding, the governance, and the structure of the sheds. So I'm going to talk through all of those three areas in turn. I'm going to start with funding, which I know is an ongoing challenge. So this is about the difficulties in Shed's experience in accessing funding to run the Shed, and how the lack of funding can put unnecessary pressure on the members to work for free in terms of selling products to fund the sheds. I don't know how far that's an issue with any of your sheds. So literature showed the importance of having the funds to support the shed. And this was based on research which was done on sheds in Australia, Scotland, New Zealand and Ireland. So a number of different countries, sheds are experiencing this. So it's not dependent on the location. And they showed that the pressure that the lack of funds can place on the shed and its members, which can have a negative impact on their well-being, their mental health. So if the shed is not self-funded, so it's funded by local government or some other organisation, this meant that there wasn't any pressure on the members, which was very positive. So what happened was this placed unwanted obligations on the members, and these obligations went against what the sheds believed in, that the shed members were there to relax and socialise rather than being put under this stress to work for free. So the members were not getting the full health and wellbeing benefits associated with attendance at the men's shed. At the sheds that weren't self-funded, the participants expressed having freedom. They felt that freedom was really important to do what they wanted, which would positively influence their experience in the shed and therefore their overall health and well-being. So it highlighted that the funding underlies many of the activities that occur within the shed, and if there's inadequate funding, there were fewer resources and also fewer activities can be offered, and therefore there are fewer things that the members could participate in. One of the ways to possibly look at improving and dealing with this issue is for sheds in nearby areas to collaborate, and I'm sure there are sheds in this room that do this, and to create larger networks within the community, which could be beneficial. It can generate extra funding from selling products and offering paid services within the wider community. So sheds that only have connections with 1 or 2 local community groups, if you can expand this to maybe 5, that would be beneficial for the shed, as it would allow more opportunities to engage in fundraising for the shed. It would be useful, and we feel it would then be useful for us to explore further how far being part of those networks can have an impact on the available resources. So funding, leading to competition for resources among members and among sheds, and an obligation which had a negative impact on people's health. So the second point that came out of the literature was around governance of support. So talking about leadership and the quality and style of leadership from shed coordinators, and how this can both positively and negatively influence the well-being of members, as well as the overall functioning and culture of the shed. The style and quality of leadership of the shed coordinators and leaders came up frequently in the studies that have been published about men's sheds. In particular, the relationship between the shed leaders and the members was raised in a number of studies. And again, these are studies in Australia, England and New Zealand. So across a number of different sheds in different countries. And they identified what this was having a strong quality leader-member relationship was associated with better social connectedness. So having a really good relationship between the leader and the members then led to better health and well-being for the members. And in fact, some of the members even said that their relationship and the support they have from that shed coordinator was responsible for, and this is a direct quote, turning their lives around. It's just that important to have that good relationship. But if there was a lack of support from coordinators, and particularly what they called an authoritative style of leadership within the shed, that had a negative influence on the social connectedness and well-being of the members. In some sheds, the coordinators attempted to control too many aspects, and so the members felt trapped and their health and well-being needs weren't being considered. But having just enough rules and structure within the shed to ensure the safety of members, and safety's come up just a few moments ago, was identified as being important to allow them to engage in activities that were meaningful for them rather than being told what they should be doing. And sheds that have rigid rules or controlled by a hierarchy were seen as being restrictive. Coordinators who listened to their members were proactive and placed the shed's needs at the front of their leadership, and these particular leaders were praised by participants. The third area we looked at was physical structure. So this is about the physical location and structure of the sheds, and it referred to some of the physical features of the sheds, such as their size, their layout, their features, but also where they were located within the locality. So a lot of studies highlighted the importance of having a social area within the shed, or a social area nearby to the shed, which could promote the building of relationships through a social connection. I'm sure when you're in your workshop areas, they're pretty loud, they can be pretty loud and noisy. It might be difficult to talk to each other. I think this is one for mine, it might be difficult to listen because it's so noisy. So having somewhere to have that kind of social discussion. So one of the studies talked about using the veranda of the shed as a common area for people to congregate and have meaningful conversations. And that was a really important part of the health and well-being. Another study talked about there was a specific garden and barbecue area in the same complex as the men's shed, and various members could get together socially and create positive connections while they were at the shed. This common area was important for reducing social isolation and building the social connections. Even members who didn't use the workshop for building things reported they enjoyed having these social areas to have conversations with other men. So it enables sharing skills, learning, and the opportunity for meaningful relationships to develop when engaging in activities. The space in the shed, having space in the shed that replicates a typical backyard shed seems to be important for members' well-being, regardless of the types of activities that are occurring. We also have one study that looked at the relationship between the physical size of the shed and the health and well-being of the shed, but it didn't show, what it found was there was no relationship. So the actual total size of the shed, so long as it's big enough for everyone to be able to use the shed safely, wasn't important. What was important was how it was structured into having a workshop area and a separate social area. Even if it's the veranda or it's the garden, it doesn't have to be within the shed itself. Now, as you'll know, sheds can be in urban, rural, regional areas. They can be all over the place. We did find that there was one shed in a study that was located in an industrial area on the outside of the city. It was called the Little Black Spot. And members of the shed reported experiencing marginalisation and harassment in the areas adjacent to the shed because of where it was located. And that negatively influenced their mental health and their well-being. So even though there were benefits from attending the shed itself, those were offset by the downside of having to attend the shed where it was. And I know there's often not much choice over where the shed's going to be located, but if there is some choice, I think that's quite important. There's also, and I don't think this is particularly surprising, issues around the physical safety of the shed. So if it's an old and run-down shed that's riddled with asbestos, that might not be very safe. There was academic research that was needed to show that. So just point that out. So key points there: the social area, the common area for workshops, ease of access, the location within the town. Ease of access, I think, is one that I haven't really picked up on in what I've just talked about. But clearly, if you've got a range of people coming, particularly people who might be older and might have some health and access issues, having a shed that's easy to access for those people is going to be really important if they're going to be able to access those health and well-being benefits. So those previous studies have looked at the funding, the leadership and the structure, but as we identified just in that brief chat we had at the start of this session, there are a lot of other aspects about men's sheds that we don't know whether they're important or not. So here's a suggestion based on my research, and I think they touched on some of the issues that you picked up as challenges earlier on in this talk. The types of members. Is there a relationship between the types of members that you have in terms of their previous occupations, their experience, their skills? but I haven't put here the type of member as in, what people are willing to do, how far they're willing to get involved, whether they're willing to step up to become a committee member, whether they're going to demonstrate some activities, or in terms of whether they're going to be the kind of member that, facilitates social interactions with other members and gets those groups together. The type of funding. We know that having funding is better than not having funding, than having to self-fund. But are there particular types of funding? We've heard quite a bit about bureaucracy, and there are various grants available, but sometimes it can be really hard to apply for those. So a variety there in terms of types of funding, and the availability of other kinds of resources that might be needed to help run your shed. The age of the shed. We've heard people talking about setting up new sheds. Obviously, there's a lot of variation. Does the age of shed have any impact? And the geographic location. In terms of, we've talked, there was some evidence that being a very unpleasant part of the area is not such a good location, but are there any other impacts in terms of geographic location for the shed? The economic base of the local community. So we usually find that does have an impact in lots of ways on different kinds of issues in the community. Does it have an impact on the success of the men's shed? And largely the networks that the shed has and the impact of those networks on the men's shed's ability to become successful. And I'm actually going to, having picked up on the very brief discussion that we had right at the start, I want to add to that turnover amongst the committee, and I also want to add to that the kinds of bureaucracy and legislative framework that you're having to deal with in both establishing but also maintaining the shed, because I think those need to go on the list as well. So that's been a bit of a quick run through of some of the research that we've been on. I have absolutely no idea how we're doing for time. I'm coming to the end, so just got a thumbs up, so I take that as a good sign for timing. So I just wanted to tell you a bit about the next stage of the research. So this collaboration between colleagues at Curtin University WA is ongoing, and I really wanted to tell you a little bit more about what we were going to do in the next shed, which is probably a bit closer to what Professor Hassan was talking about at the start. So what we want to do next is to look at what factors associated with higher levels of social and emotional well-being. So we want to look at what makes a successful shed, and then how does that translate into health benefits for the participants, for the members. So there's very little longitudinal research looking at how a men's shed's members' health and well-being changes over time. There's a lot of cross-sectional research, as in we studied it once, and that was enough. We just went in, we looked at it once, and we made a decision. But if we only look at something once, we can't tell what comes first. So, for example, in terms of volunteering, a lot of you are volunteers, probably all of you are volunteers because you won't be here if you weren't volunteers. But research shows that people who volunteer up to 15 hours a week have high levels of well-being, and people who volunteer more than 15 hours a week because they're struggling with all that bureaucracy report lower levels of well-being. But for that first group, what we don't know is what comes first. We don't know if the people who volunteer are already feeling pretty good about themselves and therefore put themselves forward to volunteer, or if the volunteering is what makes them feel better about themselves. That's what we don't know. So that's what a longitudinal project aims to do by going in over time and saying, this is what happened here, then this is what happened here, and then this is what happened here. Has it changed? So we'll be surveying, we will be surveying you guys and some of your members at 3 intervals over the next 12 months to see if there are any changes. And I'd really love to, while I'm here, I'd really love to talk to any of you about the project. Very happy to do so. And this is the team I'm working with, Peter McAvoy and Jonathan Bullen at Curtin University, who are both great researchers. Peter's a psychologist and Jonathan was a psychologist. He's now in our medical school. So they're both health researchers, so they can keep you on track in terms of the health benefits. So I've given you a bit of an overview of what are some of the key factors associated with success, some of the things we don't know about that we're trying to find out a bit more about, and as I said, really happy to talk to you all more about this and find out a bit more about that for the rest of the conference. And tomorrow, I'm very privileged to be on one of the panels. That one we're going to be talking about thriving sheds, so I'm very much looking forward to that. So thank you very much for your time this afternoon, and we may or may not have time for questions.
Hello, thank you very much, Professor Holmes. It's fascinating and it's incredibly powerful information. We've probably got time for a couple of quick questions, and bear in mind, as Professor Holmes said, you're here tomorrow for the panel for Thriving Shed, where we'll be able to kind of follow up on some of this discussion. Is there a question at the end?
Yeah, my name's Daniel Stevens and I'm from the Bayswater Men's Shed. My shed fortunately is open on Saturday, so it can attract younger people, because don't forget, a lot of younger people work during the week. So a lot of men's sheds, some of them are open on Saturday and some aren't. And the ones that aren't open on Saturday, they can't get younger members because obviously younger members have to work. So how can they get around that? Do you think it's important that sheds look at opening up on a weekend day? Do you think that's important moving forward?
Well, I think there's some different options. I mean, a lot of voluntary groups talk about wanting younger members. There is some research suggesting that younger people engage in different ways in associations. So a lot of their connections are online rather than face-to-face, which may or may not bring similar benefits to them. But I would kind of think around the box, and I'll probably try and touch on this tomorrow when I talk about thriving sheds, because we have looked at how voluntary associations can make themselves what we call recruitable, so they can be places that people really want to get involved in and they really want to volunteer for and belong to. And it's very much, you kind of hit it there, it's very much about thinking about, how can we make it easier for people to belong? What's, on their own terms, what are they looking for? So, weekends is one. I don't know, you can do evening activities or before work activities, so early morning, whether that's possible, whether there's, depending on where you're located, whether you can do something at lunchtime, so something that might fit into the working day, depending on the community you're in. So whether you're in an agricultural community, whether you're in a business community, there's going to be different kind of times of the day that might be more suitable. Might have to come back to this, because I did have something else I was going to respond to, and it's just jumped out of my mind. But it is very much about sort of being able to find the times that work to do that. Younger people often don't want to have to make a big commitment, so they don't want to feel that I have to come every week. But if it's made easier for them to drop in, that will work. But I'm going to sort of collect my thoughts on that, and I'll come back to it tomorrow at the panel. That's great.
Hi, my name's Steve Brown. I'm from the Hanwell Way Community Men's Shed. We deal exclusively with men with challenges, be they physical or mental. We have a small membership, a core group of people. Watch them and the carers that come with them. We are finding also that funding is a little more difficult at the moment, because it comes out of the core group's wallets. We would be looking, and we are investigating, how can we get people to be more interested in us. We have spoken with the Lassenby town or child, whatever you want to call them. They're quite interested, but they have no funds available at this moment. But what we are seriously looking for is to maintain the ship and maintain this sense of well-being within these individual members that we have.
Okay. So obviously you talk to your local council, you talk to your local body. Have you, I mean, you know, network seems to be really important in developing partnerships. So I'm wondering if there are other groups in your area, however broad you want to define that, who might be doing some associated work or have similar interests, and whether there's some way of working together to look for resourcing, whether you might be able to put together some kind of joint proposal that could go to a funding body. I mean, there's all sorts of, and I'm going to draw on my experience being on my school P&C, where we were looking at small local grants. You know, there were all sorts of various ones around. The local shopping centre sometimes did one, Westfield sometimes did one, Bank West sometimes did them, these small amounts. Now, I know this is problematic because that's not ongoing funding. That's kind of, and it's often project-based. You know, you can use it to buy a few things. You can't use it to, you know, necessarily keep things going. But it might be the starting point. It might be able to give you a little bit of space to think about how to get that ongoing. I don't know if the shed that you're using, if it can be used by other groups who might be able to maybe pay for its use or use the facility at different times. Because that's, you know, obviously what a lot of groups do is a lot of associations do. If they own a premises, they would, you know, hire it out as a venue, or, you know, if there's other groups that would pay to be able to attend one of your workshops. That, you know, there's some kind of possibilities there. I know they're not obvious. I know they're not some easy options. That they involve quite a bit of work. But maybe starting by looking at what other groups in your area, was that Bassendean you said? Yeah. Other groups in Bassendean who have shared interests and getting together and thinking about, okay, how can we find funding that will benefit us all? Or is there something we can do to share our resources?
Thank you. I think we've got time for one quick question.
Yes, more a statement than a question. With the turnover now of the committees, the makeup of many sheds is mainly of old fellas that a lot of led very busy and stressful lives. When they go to the men's shed, they join men's sheds to relax, do their bits and pieces, and a lot of them don't want to go back to stressful committee member type jobs. So we've got to look at that also and be happy that they're coming to our men's sheds and feeling that they can do their bits and pieces without going back to a stressful life. The other bit I'd like to add is members that pay their fees and don't turn up. A lot of these guys have been members of the shed, they're paying their subs only because they can turn up on any day and have a cup of coffee and talk, but they feel they're helping your shed.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I think we do need to stop there. I don't want to cut the questions off because these are really interesting and thought-provoking questions that are coming through. But I am really assured that this has really supercharged the conversation for tomorrow. We have 3 sessions tomorrow on inclusion, thriving sheds and funding for sheds. And all of the comments, all of the questions and the content of Professor Holmes' presentation really does resonate with what's happening tomorrow. And we won't just have time for questions, but there'll be a lot of active discussion around that, about how we can solve some of these wicked problems that exist within the sheds. Wicked problems. Just very quickly, as a token of our appreciation to Professor Holmes, Jackson has got a wine table that's been provided by the Rosamond Park Bench Shed, and something to go in the wine table. So, round of applause, please.